And we are live again. It's Simon Haigh, the growth strategist. And this is the second of 4 episodes with Paul McCarthy. And we're talking about disruptive leadership. And last week's session went down really well, a huge amount of interaction from the world out there. And Paul, just to remind everybody, Paul is a speaker on disruptive leadership. He's a positive disruptor of the status quo. He's a catalyst and author of Fired Leadership, which is an amazing book. It's coming out and has some great endorsements from some amazing thought leaders globally. And what we'd like to do today is talk about the second aspect in the series, which is dispelling the myths of disruptive leadership. So, Paul, it's good to see you again.
Nice to see you, Simon. I'm chuckling to myself because I've actually had some conversations about this topic with some friends this week, and around the myths of disruption and disruptive leadership. So I think that the term is very misunderstood, and a lot of people think it's a negative connotation straight away, even if you look at the way we define it in the dictionary and the way we talk about it. So looking forward to this conversation and see what unfolds, really.
No, absolutely. You know, when you take it at face value, when you hear that, because there's so much status quo, there's so much conservatism, there's so much based on existing models and myths in the corporate world and the vested interests. When you use words like disruptive, it sends some people to the hills. You know, it can have connotations around, you know, troublemaking or causing problems or disrupting change, you know, and people like to feel as though they're in control, and so but your take is, and I agree with it, is we need disruption. You know, the status quo can't go on forever, you know, and you know, and we do need to think and act in different ways. We need to innovate. We need to daydream at times. We were just having a conversation before, and you know, 30% of your time should be about thinking about new ways of doing things, and don't rely on the old ways all the time. So I guess maybe we'll just jump in. And when you talk about disrupting the myths of disruptive, or dispelling the myths of disruptive leadership, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, you know, so typically the word, even if you define it, if you look in the word, the dictionary, the word disruption means basically, disintegrate, to interrupt, to radical change. And then somewhere hidden in those little kind of synonyms as well as innovation. All right. And so when I talk about disruption, the backdrop for me, Simon, and everybody, is to actually reframe how we see the term. So as I said in the first session, we've normalized dysfunction. And what about if we can normalize disruption, and we can see disruption in a positive way? So disruptive leadership and disruption, they aren't these terms that refer to, you know, leaders who are just troublemakers for the sake of being a troublemaker, or, you know, just coming into a meeting and usurping the way it's always been done. And you mentioned earlier about the status quo. And let me just be very clear. If the status quo worked, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, right? Disruptive leaders are the catalyst for helping organizations to understand and see what's not working. And I'll talk later about what defines these leaders, because I want people's perspectives about what the myths are out there as well, because we have to have almost like a narrative change at the macro level first about this term before we can start to see the value that these leaders bring. So it's really interesting to see people's prejudices and biases. And I was in the pub the other day with a friend. I talked to her about this episode we were doing coming up. And the first thing she said to me was she thought about Donald Trump as a disruptor. And so people have got those perspectives out there. So I'd like, curious on what you think and what others might think about this term.
Well, certainly he was and is a disruptor. I think there's another layer to that, which is what was his intention? Was his intention the right intention? And that's another conversation. But I agree definitely. From my perspective, it's interesting. You mentioned change, and and we've got some comments coming through, which is great. And it's interesting, that we wouldn't need to think disruptively if the fact that there's such a huge change management industry, isn't there? Like, you have huge, great consulting firms around the world. You have change management, experts. You have process improvement experts. You have process re-engineering experts, and I'm qualified in a lot of those areas, which means organizations realize they have to change, right? But my experience with all of that area is they realize it, but they want to still channel it within some sort of constraints, right? So it's kind of sanitized version of change. And I've often seen in the work that I do that they think they want to really change the world, but then when you go in and you suggest this and that, oh no, we don't want to change it that much, right? So how do you get over the fact that in the minds of, in the practices of the consulting companies, change management is all about getting fees, so they need to keep the client happy, and therefore they're not really a lot of them pressing that significant change button. How do we get past those preconceived ideas of change as being a sanitized version?
Well, I think a lot of organizations, basically, I said this maybe in the last session, or I say this quite a lot to simplify this concept, but a lot of people, organizations and leaders are putting a different shade of lipstick on the same pig, and they're putting another label on it and assuming that will be sufficient. Just interestingly though, before we carry on, I'm on LinkedIn I'm on LinkedIn Sales Navigator a lot, and about 4,000 to 5,000, I get like 4,000 to 5,000 new role profiles for disruptive, who've got disruption in their title.
Yeah.
Every day, Simon.
Yeah.
Every day. So 5,000 people every day on LinkedIn are on average putting disruption in their title. What does that tell you? That tells us either that people think it's a fad, a phase, or it's part of living in this modern world where change is constant and we're starting to drip feed. But to your point, what I think I'm hearing underpinning that is, how do we make disruption seem good for business, and
Absolutely.
how do we actually show the value that disruption and disruptive leaders can bring businesses?
Yeah.
I think the answer is quite simple. First, we need to get out of our own way, and we need to be open to redefining and reframing our understanding of the terms.
That's exactly what I wanted to come on to next. I think we need to get away from thinking that's, controlling strategy and certainty, and having nice, conveniently laid out 5-year plans, all this kind of sanitized version of the illusion of control, right? That's what I'm saying. We need to get away from that and move to what I would say 4 key pillars of innovation. Number 1 is imagination. Number 2 is drive. Number 3 is curiosity. And number 4 is attitude. Imagination, drive, curiosity, attitude. And I think leaders should be rewarded for demonstrating those things as much as the traditional ways of thinking about things. What do you think? Imagination, drive, curiosity, and attitude. They should be embedded in KPIs.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna kind of add another layer onto this, because I mentioned in our first session that there were 6 qualities that disruptive leaders were characterized by, and I asked you towards the end of that session around, like, would you like leaders who had these qualities? Now, let me just reintroduce them and overlay them onto what you're saying. So, disruptive leaders are purpose-driven, right? So they're motivated by a bigger picture. That's the first one. They're enhancers, so they've got drive. To your point, they've got drive. They anticipate challenges. They anticipate trends ahead of others. They're often marginalized because of it, but they're purpose driven, right? So they're thinking about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
They're also adaptable, so they see opportunities to transform. And then guess what? That adaptability comes from their curiosity, right? That you mentioned in your third area. Now, you can't have a bigger purpose and be aligned to a bigger purpose unless you have an imagination, to your first point. Right, but they also think differently, so they see things differently, and they dare to think and act differently. So it's their attitude, and by the way, they're also very decisive. They make decisions quickly. They embrace uncertainty with agility and resilience. And these are all my terms, of course, in my work. They're courageous challengers of the status quo. right?
Yeah.
So when you put all of that together, Simon, and you overlay it onto what you're saying, imagination, drive, curiosity, and attitude, you know, one of the things that always surfaces when I have this conversation is, wouldn't you like a leader like that in your organization?
Yeah. Yeah.
If we could just change the moniker, because someone else said to me earlier on this morning, what about if we just change the word disruption to catalyst
I was,
or to innovator, right?
I was going to come on to that. I was going to come on
What?
to that.
Yeah, why? Why would it make you more comfortable if we changed the word of what this really meant? I mean, that says a lot about the way we've ingrained a dysfunctional understanding of a concept that actually is going to be our future currency to
Yeah.
continued innovation.
No, I agree. And it's interesting, you know, it reminds me, many years ago, 15 plus years ago, I wrote an article that was published when I lived in Australia, and it was titled C plus I equals E. And there was a little algorithm, collaboration plus innovation equals empowerment. And I remember I came up with this term, the fuzzy cycle of innovation. I called it the fuzzy cycle of innovation. And what I was talking about was that innovation in itself creates new knowledge, perspectives, and ideas, which in turn then stimulate the need for more information, and therefore generating more knowledge. And it's never ending, right? And I called it fuzzy because, you know, a lot of it is qualitative. But I'm now sitting here thinking, why don't, you know, we have CEOs and COOs in organizations? Why don't we have CIOs, Chief Innovation Officers, right? Why don't we? Why don't we?
Well, it's interesting, and this is not a plug for my book at all, but one of my endorsers is actually a chief innovation officer.
There you go.
And that term is becoming more and more accepted, just like chief disruption officer, Simon.
Yeah.
You know, chief disruption officer. Some people think it's a sexy title, it's another C-suite edition with you know, no substance behind it. But actually, if you think of companies like, you know, Tesla, you think of Netflix, you think of Amazon, you think of Airbnb, you think of Uber. Even when we invented the airplane, these were all disruptions of their time that were not understood because they changed the status quo. But what people didn't then talk about was that these changes came about because the status quo wasn't working.
Yeah.
So why are we not talking about that? Disruptive leaders are catalysts. You know, to use Korn Ferry's research on self-disruptive leaders, they're actually change makers. They're proactive change makers. So again, why wouldn't we want people like that in our organization if we can get out of our own way? And someone put a comment in the notes here around there was a contradiction that they couldn't see innovation without having disruption. And I completely agree. You have to have the conditions to create disruptive thinking that leads to disruption that results in innovation. But before that, and this maybe speaks to the myths and dispelling the myths, you have to create the environment in the organization so that there's an openness and willingness to see the value that these kinds of leaders bring, which means confronting your own biases.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, we have hundreds of biases. And, you know, when people hear the word bias, they just think of unconscious bias. But there's all sorts of biases like anchoring and groupthink and proximity bias, and I think we need to think about, we really do now. We need biases and habits because they kind of stop our brains from exploding, but we really and I think organizations leaders really need to focus much more on what is driving them. How to what extent are they hampered or helped by bias? So just to go back about the myths, and you know, you say in the book that leadership is broken, and you know, ego-based leadership really doesn't work. I mean, tell me more about what you mean by that.
About ego-based leadership.
Yeah.
And I think that is also in parallel. There's a parallel track with leadership groupthink and ego-based leadership. And to your point, yes, ego is useful in a certain context. However, many will deny this publicly, of course, but the reality remains in the corridors of organizations. When you want to find out the true nature and the culture of leadership in your organization, you have to be that fly on the water cooler wall to understand the dysfunction, the silo-based approach to thinking and behaving. So ego-based leadership really is the antithesis of disruptive leadership. And here's why, Simon.
Yeah.
Ego-based leadership is driven by self-interest, is driven by narcissism.
Yeah,
I'm not a
exactly.
qualified psychologist, so I can't say
Yeah,
this with any conviction about treating people like this, but ego-based leadership comes from narcissism, comes from a self-centered approach to leadership, and career focused, right? Now, let me
yeah,
just contrast that. Disruptive leaders, if and when we can get past the veneer of this, we just don't like this term, right? Let's see what they actually are first. So what they are, they're driven by something bigger. They're the leaders when we've all been there, right? Imagine the scene. You're in a boardroom.
yeah.
The boss comes up with this great idea. Everyone else around the table does not offer dissenting perspectives, and they say, we really like your idea. But the bosses ask people for their honest feedback, right? Now, those 11 people will go out the room and talk about their real feedback when the boss isn't there. The disruptive leader, because they're driven by what motivates the organization for a bigger, higher purpose, will provide the answers to the questions they were asked. So you tell me, do you not want honest leaders in your organization that are driven by something bigger and not their ego?
No, absolutely. And it's interesting. That reminds me, in the article that I wrote those many years ago, I went on and talked about what I call strategic serendipity. And what I mean by that is there are two types of luck, right? There's the natural luck. So it's a luck of the draw where you're born in the world and how you look, right? That's just luck of the draw. And there's another type of luck, which is kind of you make your own luck. And I call it strategic serendipity, right? It's working hard and making the right choices, or making the best possible choices. And I talked about through innovation. So we talked about innovation and the collaboration process. New knowledge and ideas and perspectives are generated. And this in turn requires a strategy for the capture, implementation, review. And it's a self-propelling, perpetuating cycle. But the key ingredients are innovation, which is disruption, and collaboration, which is the opposite of ego-based leadership, right? It's democratic decision making, sometimes dictatorial execution, but it's being open, and it's letting down that front of ego and being open to other possibilities. And so I was talking about this 15 years ago, so how do you convince organizations that that once they open the curtains and allow for disruption / innovation and non-ego and collaboration, that inevitably possibilities unfold? Obviously, they still need to manage the process, but possibilities can create further possibilities. How do you get leaders to really commercialize that?
Yeah. So just before I go on to that piece, you talked about collaboration and strategic serendipity. It might surprise people as well to hear that disruptive leaders are very quick at collaborating and looking for opportunities to collaborate with peers, with organizations, with competitors. But they also build trust quickly, which, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, disruptive leaders, how could they build trust? They're actually the glue that binds organizations to a higher purpose, right? Remember some research that we talked about in one of our conversations. The future currency of leadership is, if my purpose doesn't align to the organization's, I'm either not going to join or I'm not going to stay. That results in its own costs and expenditures. We won't go into that. We will another conversation around that. But in terms of how do we get disruptive leaders into organizations and showing the value and showing why we need them? Well, remember at the end of the first session we did, I talked about this thing called the Global Innovation Index report.
Yeah.
That's the macro picture, which basically, in a nutshell, for anyone that missed the first session, the level of innovation that our countries around the world have is determined by by how often they encourage leaders and organizations to be disruptive.
Yeah.
So simply put, if we discourage disruption, we will reduce our ability at country level in the years to come to be innovative. That's the bigger picture. Yeah. So now let me remind people again, to answer your question, Heidrick and Struggles, they estimated pre-pandemic that a leader's ability to be disruptive had the biggest effect on their leadership potential. That was pre-pandemic. before the largest disruption in global human capital history that we've experienced. So the research is showing us that actually to attract and retain the leader of the future, because by the way, the numerous challenges that disruption causes will need a different kind of leader to help navigate organizations through. So in order to attract and retain that kind of leader, we need to be starting to equip our systems now. And when I say systems, I mean the way we identify, recruit, onboard, and develop leaders. So simply put, it's a case of saying, if you don't invest in this talent, because you've got it in your organization now, and if you don't invest in new talent on the open market, you will quite simply not thrive as an organization. You will be left behind, your competitors will overtake you, and all of a sudden your P&L balance sheet will look quite different. Heads will be on the line. The board will demand resignations. And I'm going into a lot more detail here. But simply put, unless we don't change our understanding of the term to begin with, we'll never see the value that these kinds of leaders can bring.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And it kind of brings me on to, I guess, the next part of this conversation. We talked a little bit about leadership, but then you mentioned in the book the need for new organizational structures. And to what extent do companies need to change their structure or their reporting lines, or what the whole area of organizational structure? Does the way that companies are currently structured, does that hinder this, or any observations on organizational structures?
Yeah, we're not set up. Our organizations are currently not set up to be able to identify or engage and cultivate and embrace disruptive leaders. I mean, if I just talk about a few others in the the industry that are saying the same thing, really, or at a certain level they're saying that there's overlap. So we talk about non-linear thinkers, we talk about rebel talent, we talk about professional troublemakers, we talk about misfits. These are all other people's work that I'm really pleased to see that there's a surge in interest. But really what organizations need to do is they need to review and audit their systems and their processes to determine whether they're future ready for the kinds of leaders that they need going forward. Now, that's no easy feat, but there are maturity models, there's checklists, there's readiness assessments. And I would ask and urge organizations, in order to get ready for this, to start to look at how efficient and effective their systems are. Because chances are you've got so many leaders that have these capabilities in your organization and they're not being leveraged. So again, if they leave, there's a significant cost to replace them. If they get fired, there's also a significant cost to replace them. So why not create the conditions and the culture to have these people, these leaders, these leaders with these capabilities to actually help evolve your organization?
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's a challenge for organizations because they're balancing. It's kind of like a three-legged stool. On the one hand, they're dealing with today and the issues today. They also need to, so it's all about balancing revenue, but at the same time, they need to be thinking about risk as well, and then building reputation and building a pathway for the future. And I think, given the shareholder structure and stuff, the focus on today, right, seems to be predominant. And but you're right. I think growth you need to be you really have got to, as you said before, if you're a one-person business, you need to be dividing your time between thinking, selling, and delivering. And I'm not convinced that large companies spend sufficient time on the thinking. I think it's about the here and now. It's about the selling and the delivering. And I mean, how do you get big? Sorry, you're going to say?
I was just going to say, for those that may know Clayton Christensen's work and the work he's done in disruption in the business field, I mean, some of his well-known statistics show that if an established company pursues growth in a new market, the odds of success are 6 times greater. And the revenue potential from that success is 20 times greater than in incremental growth in an established market. So basically, disruption is good for business. So what he's basically saying is, if you pursue, disruptive leaders can help you identify opportunities for growth in areas that you're trying to explore revenue generation. And if you do that and you take a risk on them and you embrace them in your organization, they can generate up to 20 times greater revenue for you. Now, who wouldn't want that if you're trying to marry the relation, if you're trying to marry the advantages of having a disruptive leader with the ability to generate ROI and actually advance your organization, why wouldn't you?
Yeah, yeah. It's good to see comments from Bimmy, who I know well, and Brian Kennedy. Be honest in the organization and be taken aside because of your comment.
So true, Brian. So true.
Yeah, yeah, and
Let's just talk. Can we talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Because therein lies the hypocrisy of leadership, which is a whole bigger conversation. But
Yeah.
if you're in a meeting with a set of leaders or C-suite or the board, and they say, "Hey, Simon, I want your honest opinion on this," right? And you give your honest opinion, 9 times out of 10, you're marginalized, discredited, or fired. Why is that? So why is it we still put these one-page mission statements on the wall that talk about, Brian's point about honesty, but then if you do, there's a complete incongruence. And again, the disruptive leader, far from being the disruptor in that context, because they're driven by something greater, they will help elevate everyone in the organization. Now, I know this sounds a bit woo-woo, but what I'm trying to use this for is to show disruptive leaders are actually what you need in your organization to help your organization be congruent and not hypocritical, and to make money.
No, I agree, and and I've written about this as well. Leaders need to be transparent and honourable, right? And we can. What I mean by that is that we can all sense when our leaders are not telling the truth. They're either, as Michael Dell once said, that they're either perfuming the pig. They're either making bad news sound better, or they're just not sharing enough news. And it always backfires because human beings, what do? We fill that void of uncertainty with anxiety and doubt, right? So lack of honesty in organizations never actually works for the best, right? And yet it seems to be the convenient life raft because it's too confronting. What do you think about that?
Well, as I said earlier, the 6 qualities of a disruptive leader, the last one I mentioned is that they're transparent, which means they courageously challenge the status quo. So we've all been in a situation where we come out of a meeting, we wish we'd said something, we didn't because we're worried about politics and we're worried about promotion, we're worried about all that ego-based leadership, right? We come out of the meeting and we speak as a group and we say, yeah, we would have done that, we would have said that. But the disruptive leader is there non-judgmentally, just says, well, I'm in it for something bigger. So I'm not worried about the politics. I don't play the political game. I'm honest. My currency as a leader is honesty and transparency. And so, my thought quite simply on honest leadership is that there's not enough of it. And actually that is causing and perpetuating organizational and leadership culture toxicity.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's great to see Scott McInnes there as well. And just in the last couple of minutes, I've talked quite a lot about, the fact that resilient leadership provides a bridge to the future. And what I mean by that is that resilient leaders are pragmatists. They balance current action imperfection. In other words, there's no leader has all information, right? So they know how to be pragmatic about the fact that information is imperfect, and they balance that then with setting long-term visions, right? So they're setting long-term visions based on imperfect information or not the complete information. How do we persuade more leaders to take that leap, to realize that you're never, if you wait to be perfect before you innovate and disrupt, you're going to be waiting forever? There's a leap of faith involved, isn't there?
There's a leap of faith, but there's also a way of working with, if you want to produce constant innovation, I think it's Korn Ferry that talk about this in their research on self-disruptive leaders, then what you need to do is almost like the agile and the waterfall approach with IT transformations. You need to constantly innovate by prototyping. You need to be quick to prototype. You need to be quick to accelerate down a path if it works. You need to be quick and decisive, another quality that they have, right, as a disruptive leader. You need to be decisive when things don't work. And you need to put that culture in place. So the ability to fail, the ability to take risks. And, a lot of organizations are putting these things in place, like labs. I talk about fired leadership labs. You can have disruptive leadership labs where you're going in to experiment, to ideate, to prototype, and then you get a minimal viable product up. All of a sudden there's interest in it. All right, that's how I believe that we can start to stagger this as we introduce this philosophy and mindset and approach further.
Perfect. Well, we've just hit the just over the half an hour mark. We've had some great input there from Scott, Bimmy, Brian, and Bushra. I'm hoping I pronounced the name right. Thanks for all your input. It's been great comments, and I know that there's a lot of interest in this subject, and it's a necessary interest because change is required. So we're going to have another couple of sessions on this, and watch this space. I know there's and please keep in touch, connect with Paul. I think he's passionate about this space, and if you have any comments about any kind of aspects or sub aspects of this you'd like us to explore, we might even be able to extend the series at some point, Paul. So any final comments from you around dispelling the myths of disruptive leadership?
Yeah, I think from what you've heard and from what you've read, and please reach out to me if anyone wants to talk. You can find me on LinkedIn or paulmacleadership.com. From everything that's around this topic, one of the things I would ask you is if we could take that term away, disruptive, if we could just look at the quality and the substance of a disruptive leader, and what they do, what they bring to an organization. Is that the kind of leader that you would want in your organization for the future? There's only two answers, yes or no, right? And if it isn't, we end the conversation. But if it is, ask yourself then, why am I allowing my own biases to prevent me seeing the value that these kinds of leaders can bring? And then listen. If it helps, look in the mirror and ask yourself that question. Now, people might think I'm a bit crazy, but we're never going to evolve the leadership industry unless we have honest conversations with ourselves. So that's my kind of request at the end of this, is to kind of get people to almost do a bit of self-disclosure and ask themselves, what are their own issues and biases and insecurities that they hold? And, coming up to the third session we're going to do, Simon, start to think about, if you do have an openness to this kind of leader, what role and value do you think that they can play in your organization? Because chances are you've got loads of leaders that have these qualities in your organization right now, and you're probably not leveraging them to the best of their abilities.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm currently coaching 19 executives at a large company here in Ireland, and none of them are in the C-suite, and yet most of them, nearly all of them, have some great suggestions on the future business, right? And I'm wondering whether the C-suite are even aware of these suggestions. So we'll leave it at that. So Paul, it's been a pleasure again, and thanks everybody for your input, and we'll see you all next time. Thanks a lot. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Appreciate it. Bye for now.
Bye.